Fel ych chi'n gwybod, y person gyntaf yw'r Nick Bennett, sef y Public Services Ombudsman Wales. Mae wath na fi, mae teitl hir dag e. So diolch yn fawr iawn i ti, Nick.
It was an honour for me to be invited to be your keynote speaker this year, or so I thought, until somebody just told me over a coffee that ministers apparently don't like coming to Bilth on a Saturday. So I guess, given that there's just been a reshuffle, this is my opportunity to be late and light for the next half an hour or so. But I've got to congratulate you on the theme that you've chosen for this year's conference. I think to be talking about the devolution of services, given some of the recent events, is an excellent one. So I want to take the next 20 minutes or so to talk about some of my reflections on what I think is going on in terms of the devolution of services in Wales, the way in which that might, and I want to underline the fact that that might have an impact on the future of town and community councils in Wales. And then, I'm afraid, in terms of the day job and my role as Ombudsman, touch on some of the issues that I think it's important for us to perhaps have a dialogue on over the next few years, given some of the challenges that everybody involved in public services across Wales are facing. You know, in terms of the broader context of where we are and the recent and very dramatic events in Scotland, I think that 45% of the population voted to leave the United Kingdom. That Glasgow, the second city, Dundee, and other significant communities actually did vote to leave. And I guess the response from across the political spectrum in terms of what that might mean for a new devolution settlement, the fact that the Prime Minister and others have made it clear it's not just about Devo Max for Scotland, but there have been promises made in terms of further devolution for Wales, for Northern Ireland. And I guess as well, a further debate to be had around what devolution could look like in England, the whole issue of English votes for English laws, but also perhaps given that England is such a huge component part of the United Kingdom, what might also be done there in terms of further devolution for the North and other regions. But certainly we are going to see further constitutional change, and that won't just affect the individual home nations, but I'm sure other issues will emerge in terms of a Bill of Rights, in terms of settling disputes between those different territories, in terms of the role perhaps of the House of Lords. In most federations, you tend to have an upper chambers that makes sure they can resolve the issues that exist between the centre and devolved areas. Clearly, the Barnett formula, another issue. I know that there was a response by many involved in public policy, certainly in Wales, when further assurances were given to the Scottish people before the referendum. That Barnett would continue. That feeling that actually a population-based system is no longer appropriate 20 or 30 years on. I'm sure Dave Adamson will be talking later on about the regeneration challenges that we face in Wales. Certainly if you look at just one indicator, GDP per capita, and the fact that we in Wales are on about 75% of the UK average, Scotland is on around about 100. Yet if you look at the Barnett consequentials, funding per capita in Scotland continues to be higher than it is in Wales. According to Jerry Holtham, the economist who looked at this in depth some years ago, during a period of growth of public expenditure in Wales, he calculated that Wales could be missing out by perhaps 300 million per annum. But he was keen to emphasise that that was only a snapshot in time, that more recently that figure might be a lot lower. And that actually, in terms of the Barnett squeeze, the way in which that population formula fails to keep up with reflecting need, tends to be a problem that occurs during periods of public expenditure growth, not during periods of public expenditure cuts, such as those that we're currently experiencing. So I think Barnett is something that's not going to go away. Clearly, if we're talking about an expanded system of devolution that could include other issues such as welfare, such as income tax, then I know that the actual nature of the settlement across Wales and the rest of the United Kingdom will be a critical issue. Obviously then, there's the huge challenge of public service austerity, the fact that we've seen a reduction in the deficit, but only half of the deficit so far in this Parliament. So we still need to see further progress in terms of deficit reduction if we're going to see less indebtedness when it comes to the public accounts. I think, as the Chair alluded to earlier, we've also had the Williams Commission, which spent last year looking at public service reform, leadership and delivery across Wales. Looked at all aspects of public services in Wales. I was very proud to be a member. It was great to have that, front window seat, really looking at what's going right and what's going wrong with public services in Wales. But despite the fact that over 68 recommendations were made, I think the media and everyone else has only honed in on the ones that talk about merging the 22 local authorities in Wales. It's not just about the merging of local authorities in Wales, I can assure you of that. And as one wit told me when we were taking evidence, two turkeys don't make an eagle. So in terms of further reform, I think it's important that we don't just look at the issue of structures, but also the issue of behaviours and values, given some of the huge challenges that we're going to face over the next 10 years. In terms of those challenges, I've got a slide which really brought things home for me. And also, as well as mergers of local authorities, of course, Williams did talk about other issues. And I think it's important that in terms of talking about the future of local authorities, in terms of the evidence that we received and our reflections, it was pretty clear that actually there is no perfect single level for delivering all public services that currently exist at unitary authority level, and that increasingly there might be a role for town and community councils. But if we can look at this next slide here, which is one that I first came across when I was on the Williams Commission, I think this really does bring home to me the challenges that we face as a nation over the next 10 years or so. If you look at that top line, that blue line, which starts at 100% and continues on the upward trajectory, that should be a line that should only reflect good news. That shows the increase in the proportion of the population aged over 65, which is going to increase by a third over the next decade. Surely something that we would all normally be rejoicing in. But of course, that reflects the length of life rather than the quality of life. And of course, just this week we saw some further worrying data. I think they're saying that 50% of the population affected by chronic illnesses such as arthritis, diabetes, or high blood pressure. Certainly, over the last few years, I've got some slides to show you in terms of the number of complaints that we're receiving when it comes to health. We can only think that those are going to increase now in terms of health and care as the population ages and becomes more frail and more susceptible to other issues, including obviously cancer, cardiovascular issues, as well as dementia. So that upper line there is going to put pressure on all public services in Wales, I fear, over the next decade or so. And I guess the double whammy when it comes to the way in which we might be able to cope with this is the fact that resources continue to decrease. So in terms of deficit reduction, those lines on the bottom, which are independent, they've been produced by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, show three different scenarios. So all three show the reduction of almost 15% in public spending that we've seen since 2011. That's going to continue certainly through to 2017. It's probably after that point that you'd want a Barnett floor to make sure that when public spending increases, Wales doesn't lose out in the ways that perhaps it has in the future. But then you'll see those three different lines there are the differing lines of optimism or pessimism when it comes to future public spending. Some of you that would have heard the words of Sir Bob Kerslake, the outgoing Permanent Secretary of the UK Civil Service last week, who said that it doesn't really matter who wins the general election, deficit reduction has to be dealt with, and that broadly That is the trend for public services over the next few years, and depending on how optimistic or pessimistic you are, we won't see a return to 2011 levels of public spending until either 2022 or perhaps as late as 2025. So, taken together, demographic change and public spending scarcity mean that I don't think we've seen, these kind of challenges in public services for quite a while. This graph here shows historically what's been going on in terms of the Ombudsman's office. We exist to provide a point of recourse for citizens across Wales free of charge. And we were established back in 2005. And this graph here shows the trends since the office was open, and you'll see all of them have been going upwards. So that top line there shows the number of inquiries that we've had that have increased up to 3,000 or so. The red line there shows the number of complaints about public services that we've been receiving. And then the bottom line there does show a small decrease. And that's the other aspect of complaints that we deal with. And that's the complaints that we receive in terms of the code of conduct and councillors' behaviour, be it in town and community councils, but also for the 22 local authorities in Wales. So, over the last 8 or 9 years, an increasingly busy office. But if I move to the next graph, if I may, since starting the job 2 months ago, I thought it was important, given that, my earlier remarks about where we're going in terms of public spending, I don't expect to see any significant increase in the resources that have been made available to my office. We'll be dealing at best with a constant level of funding, perhaps, further pressures. We've had cuts in the past. I'm sure we might have some more cuts in the future, but I have a responsibility to the staff and to our stakeholders to make sure that we can cope with the challenges of the future, particularly given the increasing pressures on public services and the scarcity of resources. And these are the trends which, they're based on historic trends. We have an academic at the end here who I'm sure will agree with Galbraith's words that there are only two types of economists: those who don't understand forecasting and those that know that they don't understand forecasting. And I'm afraid my economics falls into the latter category. But in terms of trends from 2009, this is what we're looking at. So, an increase of a further 50% increase in inquiries over the next 3 or 4 years, up from 3,500 to 5,000. Complaints, actual complaints and investigations about public services in Wales increasing from 2,000 to 2,300. But I hope we'll see an ongoing decrease in the level of code of conduct complaints that we have about local representatives. So in terms of, going back to Williams for a second, in terms of community councils and the remarks and recommendations made in the report there, we did receive some excellent evidence from Lynn and his team when we were taking evidence last year, and also reflected upon the current scope and interest, if we're honest, that exists in town and community councils. And clearly, it's wrong really just to talk about town and community councils as if they are, one homogenous group. There's a huge level of diversity there, a greater level of diversity really than exists across the 22 local authorities in Wales. But we were, the report did reflect upon the fact that 67% of seats weren't contested, 12% of seats not contested at all, a worrying trend in any democracy. Only 1 in 5 seats actually where people were elected in a public poll. But we did think that there was huge scope for increasing the responsibilities of town and community councils for the future. As I said earlier, if you think about where public expenditure is currently, 65 to 70% of local authority expenditure is on education and social services, statutory areas that will be protected, which will grow as a proportion of local government spend over the next few years. So I think, our view of having more strategic local authorities that reflected the old county functions, reducing them from 22 to between 10 and 12, might be fine for those larger functions. But as I said earlier, we were clearly of the view that there is no perfect scale for other services. And there might be many services and areas of devolving services, which is the theme of your conference this week, which might well suit community and town councils for the future. But in order for those functions to be carried out, perhaps there are more things that need to be done there in terms of looking at scale. Certainly the evidence that we had from One Voice Wales in terms of looking at clustering community councils might be one such issue. But clearly another issue for us all over the next 10 years, given the challenges that we face, I think is the way in which we all conduct ourselves. This is the code of conduct which my office produces to give guidance to the 22 local authorities for council behaviour at unitary authority level, but also for the community councils to ensure good governance, not just in local authorities, community councils, but also in the national parks and the fire and rescue authorities as well. I'm keen to review this guidance and to make sure that it's fit for purpose for the future and that it works for you as elected representatives. Already I've had feedback that some of the guidance, certainly in terms of the difference between personal and prejudicial interest, can be a trifle confusing. So we've committed to reviewing that guidance over the next few weeks and months and to issue a new code or new guidance on the code before Christmas. So certainly I'm in listening mode. If there are other areas of that code that you feel could be improved upon, then I'm very happy to listen to you today or over the next few months. If we could move to the next slide, please. I mean, say the code itself is based upon the Nolan Principles, which are pretty much self-explanatory and have been in existence now for 20 years since the Cash for Questions scandal. Other aspects of the code look at issues in terms of equality and respect, the duty to uphold the law, and also the stewardship of public services for the future. And it's interesting looking at the next slide that the split of complaints is pretty much even between the 22 local authorities and community councils in Wales. And I think that's an interesting split. Moving on to the next slide in terms of how we analyse complaints, you'll see there that the biggest number come from issues to do with promoting equality and respect. Secondly, there are then issues around accountability and openness, and integrity as well being a further issue. If we could move to the next slide. I'm saying in terms of the way in which we try and treat complainants and also complaints, we have a dedicated complaints advice team in the Ombudsman's office, which seeks to be fair and ensure that we are dealing with any claims of breach of the code on evidence, that there is genuine evidence to support any claims, and that also there is a two-stage test. First of all, does evidence of a breach exist? And secondly, would that lead to a sanction? Where there might be evidence of a breach, but we feel no sanction can be applied, then we might refer that matter to the local authority monitoring officer. But we do try and ensure that all investigations are carried out within 12 months, providing that the information that we need is provided to us, and that investigations are held in private and there are no leaks to the media or other areas. Where we do find that there's been a breach, we might then refer that matter either to the Standards Commission, who can disqualify for up to 6 months, or the Adjudication Panel of Wales, who could disqualify for up to 5 years, and certainly suspend somebody for up to 12 months. If we can move to the next slide there. I thought I'd share with you, to give you some flavour of what's going on in the office in terms of complaints, and a particular message that I have here today, given that you might well be at a point where you might be enjoying additional powers for the future, depending upon how public service reform goes. We get 364 complaints, the most recent year that I got this data for. And you can see there from the complaints that were not upheld, over 314, which again, is good news. Certainly, it shows that the majority of complaints that we have are without foundation. But a significant number here, 250. There's not even prima facie evidence of any breach. Some are withdrawn. A number, little further can be achieved. And then in 23 cases last year, that we began investigating and soon found that there was no evidence of a breach. So overwhelmingly, the traffic, the business that comes to our office is pretty much without foundation. We then go on to some of those that are discontinued, 15 discontinued. A couple there, as I referred to earlier, where there might have been evidence of some breach, but we're not clear that any sanction could be imposed, go to the monitoring officer. And then if we look then at those complaints that are upheld, good news in many ways, only 33 out of 364. And of those, 13, no further action taken. 15 go to standards committees, only 5 to the adjudication panel, which I think in many ways reflects a good picture. But it also tells me that often when it comes to the use of the code, and we've noticed this in terms of the graphs I was showing you earlier in terms of spikes, for some strange reasons, we get more complaints about code of behaviour during election years, which came as a shock to me, and I can tell comes as a bit of a shock to you. I need to remind people who might be feeling slightly mischievous during years of election that using the complaints procedure is a breach of the code itself. And I tend to impose penalties on people who are definitely breaching the code in that way. Not least, given some of those slides I showed you earlier, we are facing perhaps the biggest challenges in public services that we've ever faced in terms of demographics and less public funding available. I have a finite resource. I need to make sure that I'm using that resource in the best interest of the taxpayer. And I think that means, certainly for the next few years, it's my intention to make sure that we hone in on the very, very small number of serious breaches that we do receive, and not to be dealing with vexatious complaints. And I don't want to make it too much of a schoolmaster lecture this morning, because it's a minority problem. Most do not go down this avenue, but we have had evidence of some factionalism and almost tit-for-tat-like complaints being used. And I have to remind everyone, sometimes, Dave and I have worked in a particular sector where we know, you're often judged only by the strength of your weakest member. This can be a reputational risk for town and community councils moving forward. We've analysed the data. Most recently, 20% of our code complaints came from one individual council. There are 735 town and community councils across Wales. So, in terms of Barnett share and all the rest of it, at least one town council was getting its fair share of our resources. Over 70 complaints were received about one community council as well. I mean, we can analyse this data and we tend to know that something dysfunctional is going on in one or two areas. But really, during a period of public service scarcity, some of the complaints that we receive, we had one, I think, somebody had refused to shake hands with another member before the meeting began. My view is this is bad manners, but, am I going to investigate this? Do you want me to spend taxpayers' money investigating this, given some of the, serious issues that we face in terms of poverty and, lack of public investment in certain parts of Wales? Another complaint that one councillor had cracked a joke to another councillor and their spouse didn't find it very funny. I cannot investigate issues of sense of humour. This is way, way beyond the Public Services of Wales 2005 Act. So I hope you can appreciate the views that I have there in terms of vexatiousness. In terms of my conclusions, I do think, given what William said about town and community councils, that there is a genuine opportunity for you to develop for the future, given that I do think those 11, it's a personal view, those 11 or 10 unitary authorities might be much better placed for some strategic services that used to be delivered by counties, but they certainly won't be fit for purpose for all services. That, I'm sure, gives you a new opportunity for the future. Certainly it's my intention, and I want to give you the assurance that I want to focus over the next few years in terms of the new job on the serious cases, both in terms of public service failure and in terms of failures on the code, on the serious issues. But I would remind you all, and this includes myself as well, you know, the Nolan Principles there of selflessness, of leadership, not least leadership, are important things that we all have to reflect upon if we're involved in public life. And I certainly enjoy or look forward to enjoying working with you over the next few years in what's going to be an incredibly challenging period. Diolch yn fawr iawn.